Hello and welcome to our Teaching for 21st Century webinar brought to you by the Glazov Gang and the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I'm your host, Annie Cyrus. Please use the Q&A box on your screen if you have any questions, and I promise we will get to them as soon as our special guest presentation is over. And with that being said, our very special guest tonight is David Goldman. He's the author of the book, You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sinoform the World. He also writes Spangler's column for Asia Time. Hi, David. It's an honor to have you with us tonight.
Annie, thank you so much for the kind introduction. The honor is all mine. I want to tell everyone out there that I'm deeply grateful to David Horowitz and the Horowitz Freedom Center for this invitation, and indeed for many invitations over the years. My association with the Freedom Center goes back 10 years. I'm very grateful for their generous support of my work. And I urge all of you to generously support the Freedom Center. And with that, let's talk about this book, You Will Be Assimilated. The tagline from Star Trek is intentional. China is so different from us that it's easier to think of it in terms of science fiction than in terms of conventional political science. The liberal establishment for the past 30 years has assured us that if only China became prosperous and became integrated into the world economy, it would eventually develop democratic institutions like ours. Now, that is a narcissistic delusion, assuming that the rest of the world functions the same way we do. China really is different. We tend to think of the Chinese as Romulans or Klingons. They're an aggressive, militaristic, threatening kind of people. The Chinese are the Borg. They do not want to conquer you. They want to assimilate you. They want to absorb your culture and DNA into their machine. China itself is not a country. No Chinese mother has ever sung her baby to sleep in Chinese. There are still 200 different dialects spoken. There are 17 major ethnic groups. The people out in Sichuan province speak a dialect that the Mandarin speakers of Beijing don't understand, and neither of them can understand a word of Cantonese in Guangzhou province. But it is a civilization which has held together longer than any other for 5,000 years for reasons I'll explain. And what's happened in the last decade, we have the misfortune to live in the moment of China's Great Awakening. For most of that 5,000 years, China was by far the most powerful, the richest, and during a good deal of that, the most civilized country in the world. And from the Chinese standpoint, there was an unfortunate interruption of about 200 years, which consisted of the first industrial revolution, driven by steam, the second industrial revolution, driven by electricity, the third industrial revolution, driven by computers. That's the digital age that we currently live in. But China is determined to dominate the fourth industrial revolution, which will be dominated by artificial intelligence. And by many measures, China is already ahead of the United States in many key fields. Now, my story, I'm an economist, but my story is not an economist story. It's a Forrest Gump kind of story. I spent about 5 years in a Forrest Gump-like role working as a partner in a small Chinese-owned investment banking boutique in Hong Kong. We took Chinese high-tech companies public. We consorted with Chinese officials. And I also volunteered time for an Israeli organization, which does Chinese-Israeli relations. And I went to conferences with Chinese leaders, military officials, and so forth, and just stared at them wide-eyed, looking at what they propose to do. What they propose to do is to run your life. And the problem we've got in the United States, I want to start with this and then come back to it, is something called Chimerica. That's the title of a book by a Stanford professor called Neil Ferguson and you've probably seen it in the newspapers. Chimerica means the interdependence of China and the United States. And you ask yourself, how could it come to this point where the United States of America is seriously challenged by China, which only a generation ago was a backward, third world, miserably dirt poor country? And the answer is that China massively subsidized manufacturing and gave an incentive to American high-tech companies to get out of the manufacturing business and concentrate on software. So 20 years ago, right after the 2000 recession and the tech stock crash, all the big tech companies, from Cisco, which used to dominate hardware and telecommunications, to Microsoft, to IBM and so forth, decided they were going to make more money writing software. Software is a great business if you're in a dominant position. Cost you nothing, zero, to add a marginal customer. You put your credit card down on the website, you download the software, and that's a profit from Microsoft or Google or whomever you're buying from. Apple does the design, they manufacture in China. That massive subsidy, which the Chinese, like the Koreans and the Japanese, applied to their industries, boosted the profitability of the tech sector of the United States and enriched a relatively small number of Americans, but it also helped wipe out our manufacturing base. It wiped out 10 million American manufacturing jobs, destroyed innumerable communities that were based in manufacturing, and created a situation where until just before President Trump came in, the average median family income in the United States in real terms didn't go up for 20 years. That's the first time that ever happened since that was measured. So Chimerica, this massive machine of industrial subsidies, which the Chinese applied to their economy, has made our tech industry, who were the backbone of the Democratic Party, de facto allies of the Chinese. In effect, they were subsidized. Now, of course, the tech companies will say, what are you complaining about? You get a cheap smartphone, you get a cheap computer, you get a cheap tablet, cheap Xbox, and so forth. Even if you're unemployed, you got plenty of things to do sitting around at home by yourself. I don't think that's an acceptable solution. At the end of this, I'll talk about what I think we can do about it. But let's talk a little bit more about what this fourth industrial revolution is and what China has in mind exactly. In my book, I interview the chief technology officer of Huawei. He's an Australian. His name is Paul Scanlon. In fact, 50,000 of Huawei's 200,000 employees are foreigners. Huawei bankrupted its competitors in Europe, including Lucent, and it hired their talent. So Huawei now spends twice as much on research and development as its two major competitors, Nokia and Ericsson combined. And it holds a critical share of all the patents for 5G. Its equipment is the most advanced in the world. And it has an agenda which goes far beyond this. Why is 5G so important? Why do we talk about it so much? We in America are used to thinking of mobile broadband as a consumer product. How long does it take you to download an episode of your favorite TV program that you can watch on an airplane, which of course you can't take anymore because of the pandemic? That's not how the Chinese see it. From the Chinese standpoint, 5G in the 21st century is the equivalent of the railroads in the 19th century. Remember, before there were railroads in the United States, there was no point investing in high productivity agriculture. If you produced a big surplus of wheat, what could you do with it? Unless you lived, of course, on the coast or the rivers. You couldn't transport it because if you put it in a wagon drawn by horse or oxen, after 50 miles, they would have eaten their cargo. But once you had railroads and cheap inland transportation, then it made sense to buy combines and eventually tractors and other productivity enhancing equipment. So the population of the United States that was required to produce our food went from about 90% at the time of the American Revolution to fewer than 2% now. Active farmers are 2% of the population. They could feed half the world. In China, 5G doesn't mean faster downloads of movies. It means groups of machines talking to each other and working out production processes by themselves. Once you have vast capacity to transmit data with what's called zero latency, in other words, there's no time delay between transmitting the signal and picking it up, virtually no time delay, you can put a bunch of robots on a factory floor, give them a task, and with artificial intelligence algorithms, they can work out the production process by themselves. So flexible manufacturing and the productivity enhancements associated with that are going to completely transform manufacturing, but manufacturing is not even the most important facet of this. The biggest industry in the United States is healthcare. That's 20% of gross domestic product. It's more like 5% in China, but I think it's very likely that healthcare will be the biggest growth industry of the 21st century, particularly as the world population gets older and requires more health services. In China, there are no privacy laws. So your medical records are the property of the state. They get digitized and fed into a giant artificial intelligence server in Huawei's cloud. Your DNA is not private information. That's fed into the cloud. Your vital sign information, your current health information, isn't yours. And with the pandemic, Chinese are required to take their temperature every day. Huawei has a smartphone that takes your temperature automatically. And with a couple of attachments, it can take your blood oxygen level, do an electrocardiogram, pretty much anything else. So imagine a world in which billions of people are hooked up to the cloud with their digitized health records available for computer scanning, their DNA on file, and their health records uploaded to the cloud in real time. That's what Huawei has in mind as a means of assimilating billions of people, starting with the 1.4 billion people of China and 1 billion other people around the world in the next 10 years. Now, once you have that kind of density of data, the application of artificial intelligence can do wonders. You want to look at the possible properties of a drug. You can not only model that through artificial intelligence, but you can run through the medical records and DNA of 1 billion people and look for possible interactions. If you have a pandemic, and you can get everyone's vital signs loaded continuously in real time into a smartphone, you've got a pretty good heat map of where infections arise. And it was this level of social control by the Chinese surveillance state which enabled China to control the pandemic very quickly. I'm not going to comment on whether they started it on purpose because I've got no way of proving or disproving that, but however it started, they did get it under control more quickly, and their economy is coming out of the dive, sadly, a lot faster than ours. And it's not simply healthcare. Driverless cars. A lot of these startups in driverless cars have given up in the United States. Chinese cities have been built from scratch over the last generation. And really, don't take my word for it, folks. Go to YouTube and type in the name of Chinese cities at random, ones you haven't heard of, like Chengdu. I was out there a year ago. Chengdu 30 years ago was a third world slum. It was a backwater. It looked like a city in Africa. Now it looks like a science fiction movie set. Go look at a YouTube aerial tour of it. And by the way, 30 million people live in that one city, and its sister city in Sichuan province, Chongqing, has another 30 million people. That's 60 million people in those two cities. Each of them is the size of either Britain or France. Now, China, we tend to think of it as another Soviet Union. I have enormous regard for Senator Ted Cruz. As a matter of fact, I worked on his presidential campaign. I was part of his Foreign Policy Advisory Board in 2016. But Senator Cruz said something which I think is misleading not long ago. China is a new Soviet Union. China is different. The Russians put 25% of their economy into the military during the Cold War, and their people stood for hours in long lines outside a grocery to buy a piece of dry sausage. China has increased personal consumption in the last 30 years in real terms 9 times per capita, 900%. And you can see that in the cities. It's not a matter of fake data. You ask any Chinese, what were things, who's 35 years old, what were things like when you grew up? And he or she will say, well, I had a dirt floor, I had an outhouse, had to go to the outside pump to get water, ate rice for 3 meals a day with maybe a little bit of vegetables on it, meat once a month. Now I live in an apartment, central heating, central plumbing, I eat meat every day. The Chinese living standard is not nearly America's, maybe the equivalent of $17,000 or $18,000 a year per person in per capita GDP, but the transformation is incredible. China was a rural, desperately poor country where people lived literally on a few $100s a year 30 years ago. Now, in that intervening period, they have moved from countryside to city 600 million people. That's the equivalent of all of Europe, from the Ural Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. And to accommodate them, they've built the equivalent of a new Naples, a new London, a new Paris, a new Helsinki, a new Turin, the equivalent of all of the cities in Europe. And their cities, as I said, look like science fiction movies set. Now, there are 3 things to keep in mind about China, this 5,000-year-old civilization, which explain why it's still there. I don't think any of us have run into a Hittite recently. Not too many of us have run into a Byzantine or a Sumerian. All these empires of the world disappeared, but the Chinese are there in pretty much the same form that they've had all of this time. Those 3 things are infrastructure, meritocracy, and family. China has a blessing and a curse, and that's a river system where the 2 main rivers alone stretch for nearly 10,000 miles. That's the Yellow River and the Yangtze. There are tributaries many thousands of miles beyond that. What that meant is that beginning in ancient times, heavily irrigated rice cultivation could produce 8 times as many calories per acre as the wheat-growing civilizations in the Middle East or Western Europe. So China was always the richest country with the ability to sustain the highest population. The curse was that these rivers would flood and occasionally kill a very large number of the population. So the founding of the Chinese Empire in legend was by a man named Yu the Great, who first tamed part of the Yellow River by building levees and dams to control the flooding, and they've been doing that ever since. Now, because this involves thousands of miles of river, you need a very large government and a lot of infrastructure spending to command the labor to do the water management. China's legendary figures, the founder of ancient China, in fact, people who were worshipped as gods for thousands of years were the water engineers. And I promise you, if you look at the ancient Chinese water management projects, they make anything the Romans and the Sumerians did look like your kid's sandbox. Astonishing accomplishments. Now, to run this infrastructure, China from ancient times has created a centralized bureaucracy based on standardized exams. There's an element of meritocracy in the Chinese Empire, which has sustained it. There's never been a hereditary nobility in China. You can see paintings and drawings going back thousands of years with kids, sitting taking an examination to become an imperial bureaucrat. Today, that's the new version of the Mandarin exam is called the Gaokao. It's the Chinese college entrance exam. 10 million Chinese kids take that every year. About half of those are accepted for university. And I can promise you, if you look up on the internet, the kind of questions that go into the Gaokao, there are a lot of them. I know a little math, and I can't answer some of them. I think probably 1 in 200 or 300 American kids could pass that exam. So the Chinese kids start school at 7:30 a.m. and get out at 5 and do 3 hours of homework. Their access to the internet is cut off by the government after 2 hours of use. There's 2 hours of gameplay, the rest is study. They're energetic, and they're working extremely hard. The third element is family. Chinese feel no real loyalty to the central government. The emperor has always been like Lucky Luciano, the capo di tutti capi. He was never elected. He was never a figure of veneration, as with the Japanese. He was simply the guy who was there to make sure that the underbosses didn't kill each other. And in fact, if you look at the tragic annals of Chinese history, when there wasn't a strong empire, the underbosses fought it out with devastating implications for China. There's a book called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. You can find 30 episodes of a Chinese state TV dramatization of it on YouTube, which is their equivalent of Shakespeare plus Game of Thrones plus The Godfather plus The Sopranos, all wrapped into one. That's been Chinese history. So the Chinese tolerated empire because, as most Chinese have told me, if we didn't have an empire, we'd kill each other. They're loyal to their families. So in China, there's never been a concept of rights and obligations, as in Roman law, never a concept of the divine quality of the individual, of natural rights or natural law. There has only been a sense of loyalty to hierarchy. The emperor is like the paterfamilias. You owe him loyalty, and everything is top down. No Chinese has ever sat on a Little League committee. No Chinese has ever sat on a school board. There are no peer relationships. There's no subsidiarity, to use the Catholic phrase. There's only vertical hierarchy coming down from these guys at the top. Now, Bill Buckley famously said he'd rather be governed by the first 100 names in the Boston Telephone book than by the faculty of Harvard University. But imagine a national exam where, if you wanted to be a political official or a bureaucrat, you had to be a National Merit Scholar. And we had a government composed entirely of National Merit Scholars, 0.1% of people who scored highest in the exams. That's basically what China is. And the Chinese Communist Party is merely a new incarnation of the ancient Mandarin system. So when we say, oh, it's the Chi-Coms, don't kid yourself. It's not some nasty bunch of drunken bureaucrats like the Russians who Ronald Reagan, of blessed memory, crushed back in the 1980s. You're talking about the smartest people in China put into a hierarchy which is self-selecting. Now, our system's better, but every once in a while, a committee of smart people is going to do better than the rough and tumble of democracy. Now, every time we've had a challenge, we've risen to the occasion. We have to do so again. The communists are like the orcs in Lord of the Rings, and I think most of you have seen the movie where the little band of Fellowship of the Ring is in the mines of Moria, and they're attacked by orcs, and the orcs are climbing pillars, and they're on the ceiling, and they're totally surrounded. Then the orcs suddenly perk up their ears, and they all scamper away. And what comes along is a Balrog, a creature of the ancient world. Well, if you think of the communists as the orcs, the China we're confronting is the Balrog. It's this 5,000-year-old entity which is rapacious, clever, energetic, and has absolutely no compunction about sacrificing human life for its goals, as they have shown so many times in their history, most recently by the hideous mistreatment of their Muslim Uyghur minority of about 10 million people in Western China. And by controlling the fourth industrial revolution, by controlling the telecommunications, the industrial spin-offs, the medical spin-offs, the smart city spin-offs, they expect to reduce the rest of the world to tenant farmers. They don't think, they're not interested in sending the People's Liberation Army to patrol the streets of San Francisco. It's not how they work. They assimilate, they don't conquer. They think they'll crush us without anyone ever firing a shot. So what do we do about it? Well, you know, we've dealt with this kind of thing before. I remember back when I was a kid and I ran errands for one of the senior people at National Security Council during the first Reagan administration. Everybody, the establishment, thought Russia was doing fine economically. Look at all the steel they were producing, all the tractors. Henry Kissinger and the establishment were all pessimistic about who would win the Cold War. And I could tell you, because I spent a lot of time in Europe then, every European elitist thought Russia was going to win, and they were all trying to make a deal with the Russians behind our backs. Reagan got in and told his staff, our plan for the Cold War is simple: we win, they lose. But what that involved was the digital age. Every single component of the digital age that now makes our lives, I'm talking about smart and fast computer chips, the optical networks that power cable television, plasma displays, LEDs, the sensors that go into your smartphone camera, graphical user interface in computers. Without exception, every one of these elements of the digital age started as a project from NASA or the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. We had a public-private partnership where the great manufacturing companies had enormous laboratories, thousands of scientists and engineers, and the scientists could come up with an idea, talk to the engineers, and ask what it would take to make a prototype, and they could take it down to the factory floor, and they had the skilled workers who could try to see whether this thing could actually be made to work. So the conceptualizing, the design, and the testing were all part of the same thing. And people who did that back then will tell you, you can't have innovation without manufacturing, because otherwise it's just an ivory tower idea. You write it in a scientific journal, anybody can pick it up. It's when you have the manufacturing and design linked to the science that you get rapid innovation. So by the early 1980s, the Russians realized that our avionics were so superior to anything that they could put in the air, we would win a conventional war. When the Israelis destroyed the Syrian Air Force, which is all modern Russian airframes, in 1982, the Russian General Staff realized, Jesus, they can blow up our surface-to-air missiles on the ground. They can they know where all our planes are. They can send in suicide drones. We don't have a chance. And that was the beginning of the end for Russia. We need nothing less than a Reagan-style science driver or the Kennedy moonshot. And what I think President Trump should do, presuming that he's elected in November, which I strongly support, go to Rice University in Texas, where John F. Kennedy gave his moonshot speech. Stand in the same place and say, we're going to be #1 in technology, and it doesn't matter what it costs. My guess is it's $1 trillion over 10 years, but given that the Federal Reserve just spent $3 trillion to bail out financial markets, and we spent another couple of trillion more in emergency unemployment benefits and other props for the economy during the pandemic, $1 trillion doesn't sound like too much. We need to be tops in AI. We need to be tops in quantum computing. We need systems that will shoot down the new generation of Chinese missiles. We need to be the #1 in material science. We need to unleash American creativity, which means no more subsidies to resentment studies at universities. We need STEM programs. We need more than 5% of American kids to major in engineering, because that's about what we've got now. We need our great American companies to stop being the Western side of Chimerica and get back into manufacturing. That's going to be an overhaul of the tax structure, maybe some subsidies. Now, much as I support President Trump, things have been going in the wrong direction. Intel, which used to be the dominant producer of microchips, said a month ago they might get out of the business of manufacturing altogether, leave it all to the Taiwanese, who are now the best fabricators of microchips. Now, Taiwan is legally part of China, and a fifth of Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing engineers are now working for the Chinese, building up their home capacity because we put restrictions on the technology we can buy from the United States. That's not a solution. We have to be tops in manufacturing and tops in innovation. And as I said, innovation and manufacturing go together. The idea that we're going to be the bourgeois bohemians in San Francisco doing the design while Asians do the dirty work of manufacturing doesn't cut it. We've got to restore American manufacturing. We have to overhaul the tax system to do it. We need federal subsidies for R&D. We need to do exactly the kind of thing we did under Ronald Reagan that won the Cold War. We need to do exactly what we did with JFK, where we won the space race, what Franklin Roosevelt did with the arsenal of democracy. We've done this before. The United States of America can do it again, but we've been losing ground, and we need to act quickly. So again, that's why I wrote this book, because the hour is late and the situation is urgent. It's a much tougher problem than many of us have been willing to recognize. With that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. I'd be delighted to take any questions you have. Many thanks again to the Horowitz Center.
Wonderful. If you don't mind me asking the first question myself, why America? Why is it that China has targeted America?
Because they want to be number one and we're number one. They've got to take us out. China, as I said, considers it to be a terrible anomaly that they're not the richest and most powerful, most respected and dominant country in the world. For most of their 5,000-year history, they were. And
so this is a power struggle.
It's a power struggle, and it's also a struggle for economic control. The Chinese empire wants to be the world's tax collector. They want us to be tenant farmers. They want to control all the patents, all the technology. Every time we pick up a smartphone, every time we put bread into the toaster, every time we turn on a machine in the factory floor, they want us to pay tribute to them. The Chinese are not like the Russians. They don't have this messianic idea that everybody has to be good communist, which will make no man. From the Chinese standpoint, we're a lower order of human life. We're just barbarians. So they don't care how we govern ourselves. We'll govern ourselves however barbarians do, as long as we kowtow to the emperor and pay him tribute, and we're weak and defenseless, and they can slap us around whenever they find it convenient.
Understood. Talk about economy. The first question from our audience says, doesn't China have an aging population problem just like Japan? Won't that hurt China's economy the same as Japan's economy bubble burst?
Well, eventually, yes, but China is like a vampire that sets out in search of new sources of blood. That's what the Belt and Road Initiative is about in large part. Now, of course, China is trying to reverse the aging of its population to some extent. They had the one-child policy, which cut off population growth with the cruelest child policy since King Herod in Jerusalem or Pharaoh in Egypt. Imagine being told how many children you can have. They're now trying to reverse that. It's not clear whether they can reverse it, but what they are trying to do is put under the control of the Chinese empire all of the available surplus labor in the world, starting with Southeast Asia. There are 600 million people in Southeast Asia, and much younger populations in Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and so forth. So China is basically turning Southeast Asia into economic satrapies of the Chinese empire. A lot of the low-wage manufacturing has already been shifted to places like Vietnam. Vietnam, which is a country of 100 million people, poor country, now exports to China about 50% of what we do, coming from zero a few years ago. They're building railroads, they're building ports, they're building plants, and eventually they will drive this all the way through the Eurasian continent. Pakistan, well, that's a lot of people, though because Pakistani labor is so poorly educated, the Chinese don't have a lot of hopes for it, but the Chinese are talking about signing a $400 billion 25-year agreement with Iran. Iran produces a lot of smart university graduates, especially in electrical engineering. They're trying to absorb Turkey, which has a young population. So China, vampire-like, is pumping in fresh blood from all over the world to compensate for its aging population. Now, eventually that'll catch up with it, but not in the time frame that's going to do us any good unless we find other ways to counter them.
I'm very glad you brought that up. Iran. I don't know if you know or not, but that's where I was born and raised, Iran. And I do remember back in the time when I was in Iran, not only China wasn't receiving any credit, but rather most Iranians would avoid buying anything made in China because I would consider that family a poor family because it was so cheap. Not necessarily price-wise, I mean quality-wise. So they're not really growing fame, for lack of a better term, in Iran. They're not.
The Chinese have treated Iran as a dumping ground for cheap manufacturers at exorbitant prices. They've helped the Iranians circumvent the embargo. For example, a lot of oil that China purportedly imports from Malaysia is really oil from Iran. Officially, China imports virtually no oil from Iran. Officially, they're complying with United States sanctions, so as not to annoy the United States. Under the table, there's probably a couple of million barrels a day. No, not that much. It's but a significant amount, which is going through illicit channels. And because the Iranians have difficulty getting foreign exchange, the Chinese rip them off shamelessly. However, what the Chinese are looking at is where you have sources of available labor, the kind that can read a manual, turn up on time, be trained to use modern machinery. And Iran is one of the considerations. Now, they haven't done much in Iran recently except rip them off because China has been reluctant to pick a fight with the United States over that. But given the tensions between the United States and China, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic, it's quite possible the Chinese will say, we don't care about the sanctions anymore. You want to get rough with us, we'll pull the rug out from your sanctions on Iran and do something serious there. Turkey is a different story. Chinese are investing massively in Turkey. The Turks, for the first time, began buying Chinese goods with Chinese currency provided to the Turks in loans, swap lines from the People's Bank of China to the Central Bank of Turkey. That began in June, first time ever. And Turkey, you know, Mr. Erdogan's Turkey has very serious financial problems, and the Chinese are using that to try to break them out of the NATO orbit and make them a Chinese satrapy.
Understood. Next question is, well, it's a description and then gets to a question, so bear with me for a second. You've mentioned that Chinese government subsidize its industries. In general, it is well-known fact that Chinese government intervention in domestic economy is quite heavy. Usually, it is seen as the recipe for disaster. Why China will be different?
Well, you know, the Asian model has always involved subsidies for capital-intensive industries. The Japanese began that with the Meiji Restoration. The Japanese brought that model to Taiwan, which they occupied for many years. The South Koreans adopted it. And what the Chinese are using is really a variant of the old Asian model, which Lee Kuan Yew, the former president of Singapore, explained to Deng Xiaoping in 1979. Deng Xiaoping was the Chinese leader who moved China towards the market. We subsidize sports stadiums and airports. The Chinese and the Koreans and the Japanese subsidize heavy industry. Now, it does have some enormous risks to it because you can end up perpetuating rotten old dinosaur industry, zombie companies that should have been put into bankruptcy a long time ago, but because they've got political pull, managed to get state subsidies. But on the other hand, it's made China into the world's factory, the dominant manufacturing power in the world. The Chinese have tried to do a mixed model. Now, back in these bad old days of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party would go to a smart engineer and say, make us new invention. You get Order of Lenin and maybe a dacha. The Chinese say, come up with a new invention. We'll let you do an IPO on the Shanghai Stock Exchange and become a billionaire. So when the People's Congress met last May and approved a $2.2 trillion 5-year technology booster for the Chinese economy, there were 100 billionaires in the People's Congress. This is the only Communist Party that includes billionaires. So I assure you, this is not a Communist Party like the Russian Communist Party. I would go so far as to say that there aren't any communists in China. The closest I met to a communist was a pleasant old gentleman whose business card said, head of the Marxism-Leninism Studies Department of the Cadre School of the Communist Party of China, Beijing. And I said, well, what can I do for you? He said, my daughter just graduated from University of Chicago. Can you get her a job on Wall Street? I'm not making that up.
Oh boy. Oh, okay. Next question actually is kind of my question too. It says, I don't quite understand the difference between assimilation and conquering. Can you give an example about how China would do that?
Well, very simple. Let's say everything you buy is from China, all the patents you get are from China, all the royalties you pay are to China. All the technology uses Chinese. If they don't like it, they can press a button and a back door hidden in one of the 7 billion transistors in the chips that power your electricity grid, turn it off, and you pay them tribute. You get your assigned task in the Chinese empire, but as opposed to conquest, it doesn't mean the PLA patrols the streets of San Francisco and we have to get our orders from Chinese commissars. As I said, the Chinese are incurious about how we lower orders of human life, we barbarians, govern ourselves. It's a matter of imperial control as opposed to conquest. The Russians, when they went into Eastern Europe, sent in the Red Army, sent in their stooges, ran every aspect of life, and actually conquered places. This is much more dangerous.
And everybody thinks Russia is the scariest one, right?
Russia was very different. Russia, as horrible as Russian Marxism was, there was always a Western or Christian element underneath it. There was a messianic idea that Russia was the savior of the world and they were going to create a new man and reform the world. That at least was there in the ideology. The Russians are much more like us. The Chinese are simply a radically different civilization. There's no concept of bettering the world. You better your family. The world is there to be exploited. The opposite of right is poor.
What do you think of the newly revealed Chinese uranium deal with Saudi Arabia?
Well, the Chinese clearly expect to play a much bigger role in the Middle East. The United States, I very much support, if you pardon a bit of a detour, President Trump's America First foreign policy. It's had some really great results. For example, the deal between the United Arab Emirates and Israel is largely a result of America First. Trump told them, look, guys, we're not going to send to the American army to bail everybody out. You want security, you got to work it out among yourselves. And suddenly the UAE realized Israel was the best friend they had, particularly because they're dealing with a threat from Iran. Now, the Chinese have been playing balance of power politics between Iran and Saudi Arabia for years. They sell enormous numbers of medium-range missiles to each other. Senior Chinese strategist told me several years ago that they've sold enough to either side to wipe them mutually off the face of the earth. So they have affected what we've given them as mutually assured destruction. So on one hand, the Chinese are talking about an enormous deal with Iran. A couple of State Department officials wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal July 20th, deprecating the idea the deal would be nearly as big as some of the reports have said, but it's still an important approach between China and Iran. And at the same time, they want to approach the Saudis. The idea is everyone's dependent on them. They play one side against the other. They're the mediators. They're in control. China's interests in the Middle East are largely dictated by the fact that China is the largest importer of oil in the world. The one thing the Chinese certainly don't want is to have a war in the Middle East to blow everything up. And they believe they're making their contribution to stability by, and also making a ton of money for themselves by selling enough weapons to each side to guarantee mutually assured destruction. So that's Chinese balance of power politics.
Wow. I know this is kind of irrelevant, but we can definitely thank President Obama for enabling Iran to be able to purchase more from China.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the JCPOA and the many billions of dollars of payments, including literally crates of cash that the Obama administration gave to the Iranians, was a national disgrace. And that, parenthetically, is one of the reasons that the United Arab Emirates was so eager to strike a deal with Israel now. They're terrified the Democrats will come back and turn Iran loose on them again.
Agreed. So China steals a lot of technology. Do you think their past growth is more from what they steal than from what they invent?
I think their past growth absolutely is due to assimilation of Western technology. They've begged, borrowed, and stolen it. China does pay, I think about $40 billion of royalties to American companies for technology every year. They pay for some, they steal more, they steal huge amounts. That's their past growth. That's not what worries me. What worries me is that they have now harnessed an enormous amount of domestic as well as foreign talent. For example, everyone I think on this call has heard of Bell Labs. There are half dozen Nobel Prizes given to scientists at Bell Labs. Now, Bell Labs was eventually taken over, and AT&T's assets were taken over by Lucent. It eventually went to the hands of Nokia, the Finnish company. So Nokia inherited the Lucent assets. You know where Bell Labs is now located? Its successor? In Shanghai. It's called Shanghai Bell. It has 16,000 researchers. That's 2/3, roughly, maybe it's 3/5, but it's the majority of all of Nokia's researchers are sitting in Shanghai at the successor to Bell Labs. So what scares me is not technology that they stole, because we can always innovate and leapfrog them. If they're building stuff with our last year's technology, we can develop next year's technology. What terrifies me is that they get ahead of us in innovation. A lot of people say the Chinese can't innovate, they're conformist. Well, maybe the average Chinese is more conformist than the average American, less likely to innovate, but there are 1.4 billion of them, believe me. Among those 1.4 billion, there are plenty of creative and innovative people. And even so, as I mentioned, Huawei has 50,000 foreign employees. They do most of the basic R&D. It reminds me of the way that the Mongols won the siege of Baghdad in 1258. I forget the name of the caliph, Muhammad al-Fubar or whatever, thought, well, what can the Mongols do? They've got ponies and bows and arrows. We have walls 18 foot thick. But it didn't occur to him. The Mongols would hire 1,000 Chinese siege engineers, and they built catapults. Maybe they used cannon, and within 3 weeks they'd knocked a hole in the walls. The Mongols then came in and killed 1 million people. So even if the Chinese don't have the innovators, they're now able to hire them. So it's Chinese innovation that worries me. I think we have to stop whining about we was robbed, they stole our technology. Yes, the Chinese have a sense of business morality, which is virtually non-existent. And that is a serious concern. But an existential threat to us is China's home capacity for innovation, as well as their ability to harness the innovation of Europeans and others to the Chinese imperial machine.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier on this discussion is, you know, the Chinese kids are growing up spending hours and hours and hours a day studying, learning, and basically their social life is minimized into maybe playing some games that will develop more brain cells. Whereas to unfortunately, average American kids are growing up with being, you know, trained on being super sensitive and being snowflakes and being offended over every word that comes out of people's mouth.
That's
That
right.
has
They're being trained to make, they'd be perfect serfs for the Chinese empire if this continues.
exactly.
That's what the left is training us to be, effectively.
Exactly, and yes, I'll read you. We have time for one or two more questions. I'll read you the next question in a second, which kind of connects to this. But again, quickly going back to my motherland, the Iran thing. It's the same thing in Iran. You know, the training at a school in a very different way, but they're very concentrating on a specific topic, which is basically Islamization. That's how they raise their kids. And then you come here to America and you look at the school. I guess everybody knows Common Core had a lot to do with dumbing down our kids, but it also had a lot to do with training them to be soft and open to multiculturalism and respecting everybody and getting along so perfectly that everybody's walking all over Americans and they're not fighting back or pushing back. Am I correct on that?
Oh, absolutely. And if you go to the website of the American Mathematical Society, you see all kinds of papers and discussions and blog posts about how to get racism out of mathematics and how to promote mathematics inequality, how unfair it is that some people are good at math and others aren't. China is an absolutely ruthless meritocracy. You either pass the exam or you don't. The one thing Xi Jinping can't do is to place his daughter at a top Chinese university unless she gets a top score on the exam. That is an element of merit. There's plenty of corruption in China, but that element of the meritocracy is very hard to mess with. So the Chinese, as dominated as their life is by a totalitarian surveillance state, nonetheless have the hope that they or their kids have a chance for advancement if they work hard and get a high exam score and get into a good university, they'll get a good job. So that element of meritocracy is critical to the social glue that holds China together.
Agreed, absolutely. So next question, interesting one. Maybe India can be a buffer against Chinese dominance. Wow.
Well, you know, India has a per capita GDP about a tenth that of China right now. What India has never succeeded in doing is, number one, developing the meritocracy, and number two, developing the infrastructure to challenge China. India has a educated middle class of a few 100 million people. They produce spectacular software people. You just look at who's running American software companies, full of Indians at the top. They're brilliant people, but they also have hundreds of millions of people, maybe 600 million people, mired in the worst kind of rural poverty. The Chinese, I mean, China now has a network of railroads and highways, which is the best in the world. You can go from Shanghai to Beijing in 4 or 5 hours on a fast train, and you can sit there and, you know, hold your coffee. It doesn't shake. If I take Amtrak from New York to Washington, I have to hang on for life, and I don't dare drink anything liquid because it'll end up on my pants. Their infrastructure is spectacular. India also is burdened by the caste system. So it's very hard for them to reach into the depths of the population and get a lot of people who are talented into the university system. So until India finds a way to for example, build railroads to replace the ones that they're still using now, that the British built 120, 130 years ago. They're not going to catch up to China. As I said, it's a tenth of China's per capita GDP. It's a magnificent country. It's the world's biggest democracy, but they have to focus their energies on doing this. So I think India is a generation away from challenging China in a serious way, if indeed it ever does.
And if you don't mind me adding, India also has another big battle that they're facing, which is Islamization. They have this internal war going on inside India. Many of the attacks in India, a terrorist attack, has always been about what you just said: poverty versus rich people, and that system of brainwash.
Yes,
I know personally they were pushed back ages and years since the jihad started infiltrating India.
Absolutely. The Chinese will tell you, we don't have minority problems. If they give us trouble, we kill them all. They've been exterminating what they call unruly barbarians on their borders for thousands of years. That's the norm. Most Han Chinese I talk to don't consider the treatment of the Uyghurs anything special. They say that's just the Chinese way of doing things. It's horrible, but sometimes, sadly, it's effective.
Yes. And with that, what you just said, last question I can squeeze in. Multiculturalism seems to divide the West, but China seems to not be troubled by it yet. So will that eventually become a bigger problem for the communist rulers?
Well, the communist rulers try to establish a continuity with Chinese culture. Remember, Chinese culture is very different from Western culture. They're almost different entities. Just ask yourself, what's China's religion? When you speak about Western culture, we talk about Judeo-Christian culture. We don't talk about Aristotelian culture or Kantian culture or Rawlsian culture. We talk about Judeo-Christian culture because we were defined, first of all, by a spiritual idea. There never has been such a definitive spiritual idea in China. Confucianism is not spiritual. It's a practical, social, and political philosophy. It's based on hierarchy. So as long as the Chinese state delivers benefits to its citizens, the emperor is a good pater familias, and in return for loyalty to the emperor, you get benefits, the Communist Party will stay in power. And as I mentioned, per capita consumption has risen ninefold, 900% in 30 years. That may be some kind of record. It's quite an achievement. So it's not that easy to dislodge a political party which has absorbed 70 million Chinese, including most of the most successful ones, and has, for the most part, delivered the goods. Of course, unless you're a dissident, in which case you probably become a kidney donor, or you're a Uyghur, in which case you may end up in a concentration camp.
If you could tell our lovely audience, first of all, where they can read more of your work, and also where they can get your book, and if you could give the title one more time.
Yes, the title is You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sinoform the World. It's available at Amazon in paperback or in Kindle. I hope an audio version will be available soon, but right now it's paperback and Kindle. We rushed it into publication because of the urgency of the situation, so it's only available at Amazon. We didn't have time to put it into bookstores. Published by Post Hill Press's division, Bombardier Books. That's the conservative books imprint of Post Hill Press.
Fantastic. David, thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and giving us your time.
Annie, thank you so much for your invitation, all the wonderful work the Horowitz Center does.
Absolutely. And to our lovely audience who stayed with us, thank you so much. And remember, these webinars are brought to you by Glazov Gang and David Horowitz Freedom for free. So if you'd like to support this project, consider going to frontpagemag.com and make a 100% tax-deductible donation. Until the next time, you all stay safe and goodbye.